It's my privilege to have on the stage with me Elisabeth Motsinger and Dale Folwell. I'd like to say to you that we did invite Virginia Foxx to join us this afternoon. Her schedule unfortunately precluded that, and Dale Folwell is here in her place, not representing her, but coming from the Republican Party. Elisabeth Motsinger is a wife, mother of 3 grown children, a health care provider, and a twice-elected member of the Winston-Salem Forsyth County School Board. She's currently standing as a Democratic Party nominee for election to the House of Representatives in North Carolina's 5th Congressional District. Elisabeth Motsinger has been a physician assistant for more than 20 years. She completed her medical training at Wake Forest University, where she is currently finishing a master's degree in bioethics. Mrs. Motsinger grew up in Shrub Oak, New York, and came to Forsyth County in 1984 with her late husband and 2 children. In 2006, she won an at-large seat on the school board, and in 2010 won re-election in that election cycle, being the only Democratic incumbent running countywide in Forsyth to be re-elected. Long active in her church and community, Elisabeth Motsinger is an unwavering advocate for public education, including federal support for higher education grants and loans. Her experience caring for women, families, and seniors has helped shape her views regarding healthcare policies. It is a privilege for us to have her with us this afternoon. Dale R. Folwell is a Speaker pro tempore of the North Carolina House of Representatives and the Republican representative in the House for District 74, Winston-Salem. Born in Raleigh, Representative Folwell attended West Forsyth High School here in Winston-Salem and received both a BS in accounting and a master's in accounting from UNC Greensboro. He is a former vice president and registered investment advisor for Deutsche Bank Alex Brown, and served for 8 years on the Winston-Salem Forsyth County Board of Education, on which his debate partner Elisabeth Motsinger now also sits. Dale Folwell is in his 4th term as state representative for Forsyth County, and his legislative achievements include laws designed to improve education, crime prevention, government efficiency, and family values. It is a great pleasure to have him also with us, a great privilege for us this afternoon. Elisabeth Motsinger will speak first. Dale Folwell will speak second. We'll have a question and answer session, and then we will close with remarks from Dale Folwell and then Elisabeth Motsinger. So may I invite Elisabeth Motsinger to speak to us first.
Good afternoon. It's great here to be at Wake Forest, where I still am currently a student. I've finished all my coursework in my graduate degree, but put off my thesis while I'm running for Congress, and anybody who has a thesis understands why I would have delayed it. This conference is about the American dream, and one of the reasons I'm running for the U.S. Congress is while I have been able to benefit enormously from programs in place that allowed the American dream to be realized by people, I'm very aware of that many people coming up now will not have the same opportunities that I did. When my first husband died when I was 28 years old and I had 2 very young children, Social Security allowed us to live, to have food, to have shelter. Student loan programs, federal student loan programs, allowed me to borrow the money to attend Wake Forest University and become a physician assistant and thereby create a good life for myself and my children. Right now, poor single moms have very few options. Right now, federal money and enough money for kids to go to college is really at stake. And the American dream has always been about the ability of people who work hard and want good things to be able to achieve those dreams. In the United States, income inequality is such that 25% of the jobs in America are $10 an hour or less. $10 an hour or less. We tend to blame those people. We tend to say it's a character flaw that they don't have, that they are living in poverty. But when 25% of the jobs are basically poverty wages, you can't say that it's about individual characters anymore. I want the American dream that was available to me to be available to other children, and not just the children who are lucky enough to attend Wake Forest University, not just the children who are lucky enough to end up here. I want it for all children. I believe the land of opportunity should be a land of opportunity for all people. So I look forward to being with you, and I hope that this will turn more into a conversation than talking. So please, I'm so excited about hearing from you and hearing what questions you have.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? That's good. It's really good to be with you today, and as David said earlier, I'm here to replace Congresswoman Foxx, who was speaking, I think, at Peace College today in Raleigh. But I'm glad to be here, and if any of you have ever done anything like this, sometimes you can sit back and over-prepare. There are a couple of themes this year that have really dominated my thinking. One is documentaries about people who took what God gave them, and not that they're better than anyone else, but they're better at something than anyone else was. And I was thinking about a recent documentary that came out called Senna, S-E-N-N-A. And if you're not a Formula One race car fan, then you may not know of this movie. But it was about a famous Brazilian race car driver who was killed a little over a decade ago. And if any of you have seen that movie, what you'll realize is that not only was he the most all-time best race car driver probably in the world, at the peak of his career right before he was killed in Italy, I think his private jet was a 727. We all think about race car drivers and visually thinking about NASCAR drivers, but Formula One is quite a different thing. At the very end of that documentary, the person's at the peak of his career, making more money than anyone's ever made in that industry. They ask him what brings back his fondest memories of his whole life. And his answer was racing go-karts in England against a guy named Cal Fullerton. And that's the first kind of racing that Ayrton Senna did when his father brought him from Brazil to England to try to break into the Formula One circuit. And he started talking about the purity of racing go-karts back before there was private jets and all the glitz and glamour of Formula One racing. And it reminded me of 43 years ago, 500 yards from where we're sitting. 43 years ago, I was the paper boy on Faculty Drive. And back then, the Winston-Salem Journal not only was thicker and larger, but there was a Journal and a Sentinel, a morning and an afternoon. So when you were a paper boy or a paper girl, you had tremendous responsibility to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, fold your newspapers, put a rubber band on them. If it was raining, wrap them in plastic, and deliver them to people before they got up in the morning. Now, during that period of time, I would say that my home life was sort of falling apart. My dad was on the verge of leaving my mother to be a single mom with 3 kids, no child support, basically making $5,000 or $6,000 a year trying to raise us. And when I try to combine those two things and ask you to visualize those things, I just want to remind you that a lot of the things that we learn and that we use and that will rekindle the dream of America are things that we may have learned decades ago. It didn't take me too long because the last person on my paper route was the gentleman whose picture is hanging on the back side of this auditorium, Dr. Scales. So I delivered all the papers on Faculty Drive, and then his was the last house I delivered. And it didn't take me too long as a kid that size, at 10 years old, delivering heavy newspapers, that I was coasting down Faculty Drive and then had to pedal like crazy. Well, actually, I wasn't strong enough to pedal up that hill, so I had to walk my bicycle. It didn't take me too long to realize that when you look over to the right, before you go down the hill of Faculty Drive, at that stop sign, there's a little break in the woods. And that if I would go up that little path every morning or every afternoon, then I wouldn't be going down and going up. And the reason I want you to visualize that is that a lot of the lessons that we learn and what I think is going to rekindle America going forward is teaching kids and teaching people critical thinking skills that can help them learn how to do things better and more productively. There are a lot of other things that I learned on that paper route that has resulted in the person that you see today. The other thing that's dominated my thinking this year is the whole concept of abandonment and invisible. Those of you who may be psychology majors, I hope you focused on the word abandonment, because I think it's the concept of that and what people feel has happened to them through their government. They feel a sense of abandonment because of all the things that are going on. You know, there's lots of things that I could apply statistics and percentages to, but there are some things that seem to have the common tone of 50%. 50% of the people do not have a job after graduating from college 6 months out. 50% of the people are not paying into the system. 50% of the people are getting money out of the system. And my point of telling you that is that when we talk about rekindling the dream, we need to have more participation by everyone to pull ourselves out of the situation that we're in. The last thing I'll share with you is, and then hopefully open up for questions, is that there's another documentary out, and it's called Being Elmo. Have any of you ever seen the documentary called Being Elmo? Okay. Then, John, you might remember Being Elmo was about a gentleman, an inner city kid in Baltimore by the name of Kevin Clash, who, I don't want you to correct me from the audience, but basically at the age of 14 somehow talked himself onto the Captain Kangaroo show. Went on a field trip from the Baltimore City Schools to New York, and I think played hooky from the field trip and talked himself into the Jim Henson studios. And somewhere along the way, he was standing at a door, and some other puppeteer came out of the door and had this puppet in their hand, and he threw it in the trash can and said, "Here, you do something with it. I can't do anything with this." And that was Elmo. And my point of telling you the story about being Elmo is that I think that wherever you start in life has no bearing on where you end up. And I think I'm a prime example of that. I'll also tell you that the only way you get there is to focus on what you're better at than anyone else maybe in the world, but that you're not better than anyone else. And the last thing is that no one gets anywhere alone. Elisabeth didn't get where she is alone. David didn't get where he is alone. Pat didn't get where she is today alone. Nobody accomplishes anything by themselves. And I think that's what republicanism and conservatism, more importantly, stands for. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to your questions.
I would like to just add that while jobs like being a paperboy are really important for developing character and ability, the people who deliver the paper now are adults, and that is their full-time job. And that so there really are not jobs for kids as paperboys anymore. And I think that points somewhat to what's happened to our economy. The jobs that used to be for children are now how adults are trying to support their families.
Can I invite a question from anybody in the audience who would like to start us off? There are microphones coming down, so if you could seize the moment. The gentleman there.
Thank you. What I'd like to ask is how you can conflate the fact that there are over 2,000 billionaires in the United States at this moment who pay much less in a tax rate than the middle class and the poor do, with the idea that the Republican platform is here to help us, because it really seems to me that the Republican platform is all about helping those who have. And paper boys, as Elisabeth said, aren't boys anymore. And the world that I grew up in, I worked my way through college. Nobody helped me, but it's not possible anymore because it costs $100,000, where when I went it cost $10,000. And so the world that you describe seems like an idealization of a past vision. But how can you justify the kind of policies, particularly the right wing of the Republican Party are espousing in terms of helping some young person who can't even get a job as a paper boy today?
Well, I think that your question was genuine, but the facts that you use were factually disingenuous. I think that whatever you think the tax rate should be on billionaires, that even if we were to apply that tax rate, it would not make a dent in the problems that we're facing in this country. And you don't have to go too far than a few weeks ago when Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson were sitting on this campus talking about this very issue. We are in this situation because liberals didn't liberate in this country and conservatives didn't conserve. That's what's resulting in the job market that we have today and putting us in the situation that we're in today. We're at a tipping point in this country. We're at a tipping point in the state. I have the fourth highest unfunded health care liability as a percentage of my operating budget in the United States. The fourth highest. We have employees for the state who are in certain types of benefit plans that never anticipated that they would be retired for longer than they worked. Never anticipated that. And what I'm saying to you, and what I'm trying to answer your question genuinely, is by saying that through all of our lives, we've tried to divide people by East and West and white and black and Democrat and Republican and liberal and conservative. But now we're staring down the barrel of arithmetic. And the only way that we're going to fix the arithmetic is by having everyone have gainful employment in this economy so that we can move forward. But in addition to that, we're living beyond our means. We're living beyond our means in higher education. We're living beyond our means in health care. And those are the things that have to be corrected. And what it takes, you may not like me, my name, my tone, or my party, but what it really takes to fix these problems and connect with people not through an ideology or a party, but to connect with people through the problems that they're facing. What it takes is leaders who embrace who they are and who are willing to say, this is what I've heard your problem, and this is how I think this philosophy is going to help you get out of your situation. It takes people who embrace who they are.
Just as a wrap-up, I have no problem with your name or your face or your party, but I think that your statistics are disingenuous as well. 50% of the people is not an accurate number of who pays into the system. That's a made-up number. And in terms of what will close the gap, shutting down PBS won't close the gap either. So, thank you.
And certainly the income inequality in this country is just unconscionable, and it doesn't serve democracy well. As Brandeis said, you can have concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, or you can have a democracy, but you cannot have both. And I think we have to really talk about the fact that this massive inequality is really harming our democracy, and it's harming the ability for regular citizens to feel that they have a voice and that their voice can actually make a difference. It's really important. I do think that the 2,000 billionaires in the United States, if they were paying a much higher marginal tax rate, that would make a difference in our debt, and it would also make a difference when there are conversations about equal sharing the pain, when the people who are in no pain are being asked to have no pain whatever, while those who are suffering mightily under this economy are being asked to bear the brunt of that. That does seem a little unkind would be probably the nicest way of putting it, but it certainly is not true. The other thing about leaders who represent their point of view, actually in representative government, I would kind of think that leaders should be representing the people they represent, and that would be a very reasonable expectation of them. Mrs. Foxx is certainly not known for being someone who reaches across the aisle. She is certainly not known as someone who tries to include all points of view, and she certainly is not known as being particularly inclusive of all Americans. So while Mrs. Foxx may be a perfectly nice lady as an individual, as a representative, she hasn't really reached out to people who disagree with her.
I'd like to respond by saying that maybe a better way of saying that is that when you're applying for a job to be an elected official, it's important to embrace who you are. When we're sworn in the General Assembly or in Congress, we put our left hand on the Bible. We swear to uphold the Constitution of North Carolina. And as important as those documents are, in addition for me to the conservative platform, the real root word of representative is to represent. And on our desk, in case you did not know this, there are only two buttons. There's a red button and a green button. And as important as these documents are, the last thing that always goes through my mind is what are my people back home expecting me to do based on what I told them when I applied for this job. Now, I'm not Congresswoman Foxx. I'm here to represent who I am. But the bottom line is that the reason we got into this situation and the reason that we have the deficits which have led to the debt, which has led to the demagoguery, is that we had people who put one thing on their job application, and then when they got to Raleigh and Washington, out of sight and out of mind, they acted completely differently. I'm not one of those people, and I don't think anybody elected from either side should be doing the same.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I have a problem with numbers too, and I think we can all agree that we have a problem with health care in our country, Republican, Democrat. In preparing for this day of talks and last night's talk, I got on the Department of Labor website and looked at some statistics, and I was just talking to Howard Friedman about this, about how we have so many millions of employees in the healthcare system. I saw figures ranging from 25 million to 50 million. That really shocked me. I didn't realize we had so many. And if you compare that with some of the other numbers, you can get on the website and it's industries at a glance, and then you can see that in construction there's 5 million workers, and in retail and wholesale there are 20 million. We have 3 or 6 million cashiers in this country. And I guess my question to you is, when we have so many working in healthcare, and it's not to belittle what this university is doing, remarkable work in healthcare, but when you look at the statistics on the government websites and see where Americans are working, in what fields, and you realize there are so many in healthcare, don't you question why we are so involved with healthcare? Where is the American dream? Where is it? Is it to grow old, get sick, and be taken care of? If you look at the numbers of actors, for instance, I think there was 20,000. The number of musicians, something like 80,000. Or I don't know. I can't remember the exact numbers. And in entertainment, the same thing, be it sports or art or whatever. We have so few numbers in comparison to what we're putting into healthcare in this country. So my question is, are we looking at these numbers and are we wondering why? Why so much in healthcare? Are we sick? Are we a sick nation? Have we poisoned ourselves? Are we addicted to things? Are we, I've been showing environmental films here in Winston-Salem for 7 years and analyzing our country's environmental problems. And I think we should be looking at that in a big way.
So One of the difficulties in the United States as far as healthcare goes is we actually don't have a healthcare system. We have a series of decisions and accidents and policies that are functioning in silos. So because we as a country never said we have to come up with a system, we haven't. And it's just a patchwork, some of which works very well and some of which does not work very well. We pay more for healthcare in the United States than any other country, and we get worse outcomes for the money we spend. And we haven't really sat down and been willing to look at that system and talk about it as a whole. And when you're not looking at whole systems, you tend to create lots and lots of problems along the way. Unintended. I don't think anybody set out to make a system that produces the results we have produced. A couple of things I think really matter. One is that the most expensive healthcare in the United States is on public dollars. By the time people are elderly, by the time they're in long-term nursing home care, when they've had kidney transplants, that's now Medicare, Medicaid, public dollars. What happens is that the public insurance system basically underwrites the private insurance system. We're the insurance system for the private insurance system. They take care of people until the problems get too big, and then they become public problems. If you have a kidney transplant, you're eligible for Medicare. But until then, if you just have diabetes and hypertension, you can still be in the private insurance system. So it's a very complicated, messy system, and one of the ideal things would be to sit down together and say, how can we meet the healthcare needs of Americans and not have this be a partisan issue? The other difficulty is that profit is made every step of the way, and that makes a very unyielding system. So it's complicated. It certainly isn't serving the healthcare needs of Americans. Too many people don't get the basic preventative healthcare they need and then end up getting help only when things have become a disaster. That's very expensive. And of course, the disabilities and morbidity that goes with that is terrible. So it's a complicated system, and I agree with you that if we would sit down and say, what would a functional, healthy system that assured medical care for all Americans look like? And could we make the moral commitment to doing that?
After I left here as the paper boy, our family had to move, and I ended up becoming the paper boy at Baptist Hospital. As a young adult and a teenager, obviously watched that campus grow tremendously. As a matter of fact, the house that we used to rent is where the helicopter currently lands. There used to be a street there called Grove Park Avenue off of Queen Street. And the reason I'm trying to give you that history is that as I think about back then and how that campus has grown, and then think about the tremendous headwinds that we're facing as a state in healthcare, it's absolutely mind-boggling. I don't know if there are any students or mentees in here of Hayek and von Mises, famous Austrian economist, and then his protege ended up starting most of the schools at the University of Chicago. And they had a famous saying that anytime you subsidize something, you should expect to get more of it. And I believe that. And what has happened is that healthcare, from a state standpoint, has become the single largest expenditure that we have. I'll never forget when I was working with Alex Brown, I went to visit the Statue of Liberty once, and I was actually in the museum there and reading some of the things that people had written. And one thing that was written, a person said, we asked for employees and people came. And when you employ as many people as the state, you're not just dealing with people who are teaching kids. You're dealing with people who are employees of yours, there are responsibilities for pension, health care, and other kinds of things. And my reason of saying that is that at the state level, we focus on health care and not health. Now, I'm going to give you one of the invisible examples that may not mean much to you, but I hope it rings true after you hear it. The prime example of how now the state is the largest purchaser of health care in North Carolina. We're the largest purchaser of about everything. Tires, gasoline, toilet paper, workers' comp, light bulbs, about anything you can think of as a business, we're the largest in North Carolina. So let me give you an example how we focus on health care and not health. There are 5 things as a state employee currently that we have that are offered to our employees and our teachers that are currently on a calendar year. Their dental plan, their vision plan, their dinosaurish flexible spending account where you put money aside pre-tax and you have to use it or lose it, our Medicare Part B premium for our retirees, all of our state employees' tax returns, all of those things are on a calendar year, January to December. The state health plan is on a fiscal year. So how could you possibly incent people to plan to take care of their health and not use the health care system when you have a flexible spending account which allows you to raise your deductibles and take more money out pre-tax, but then it's not synchronized with the health plan itself? Now, I know that seems very abstract to you, but fixing all of these problems is like an ant eating a ham biscuit. We have 26% of the people who work for the state of North Carolina. Most of them are my girth, my gender, and my age and above, who have chronic undiagnosed illnesses. Chronic undiagnosed illnesses. Some of these people are prison guards. A prison guard, many of them work 12-hour shifts. Guess what they're not allowed to take to work with them? Drugs. So if you're on some kind of maintenance drug, there has to be some coordination to really focus on your health so that you get the medicine you need before you go to work. And by the way, in most of these instances, there's not refrigeration available. If it's something that needs to be refrigerated, this is like an ant eating a ham biscuit. It's just a lot of little things that have resulted in the frustration that you just mentioned.
Hello. Yes, this is on. As my accent probably gives it away, I'm actually from the United Kingdom. And when I'm back home, I guess I'm kind of recognized as what we call a one-nation conservative. But I've noticed there's a big difference in many ways between conservatives in America and conservatives in Britain. And if I could perhaps use the health service just to, first of all, show that difference, and then I'd like to go on to make a broader point, if I may. Nobody in the United Kingdom refers to our health service, which delivers free medical service to everyone at the point of need. Nobody refers to it as socialized medicine. When I hear this term over here, it jars, because I'm not a socialist, and yet, like many other conservatives in the United Kingdom, I support the National Health Service. Of course, you can pay for private healthcare in the UK if you wish. I never have. The kind of healthcare that I've received is exactly the same as the poorest and most indigenous of people. We pay per capita GDP as a percentage about 9.7. In the US, I believe it's about 17.3. If you're talking ballpark figures, you pay about twice as much as we do, and we have a slightly higher life expectancy in the UK. That speaks to me of something that is significant for the American situation at the moment. And I think one of the reasons that perhaps Americans, or some Americans, are reluctant to embrace the idea of copying something like a national health service that we have and most other European countries have is because they deem it to be socialist. I don't think it is. At the turn of the 19th, 20th century, a British political theorist, T.H. Green, looked out at society, and what he saw was a very impoverished society. Industrial workers grossly overworked, ill health, ill-educated, illiterate, inarticulate. And he asked himself the question, what is the point of negative rights in a situation like that? What is the point of having free speech if you haven't got the education to be able to articulate? And so he came to the conclusion that there needed to be something more of a partnership between government and the people in terms of the provision of health, education and welfare. Aha, socialism. Well, no, T.H. Green was no socialist. What T.H. Green wanted to do was to empower people. And by empowering them, he didn't mean empower them so that they can all be the same. His objective was not an egalitarian society, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. His idea was to empower everybody so that if you wanted to make lots and lots of dosh, you can make lots and lots of dosh. You can be a multi-billionaire if you want to. Green had no problem with that whatsoever. As long as people who wanted to paint learned how to paint. Those who wanted to craft wood could craft wood. Those who wanted to be teachers could be the best teachers. In other words, he wanted to empower people so that they could realize their full potential. And so he recommended that there should be a closer partnership between the government and the people. There should indeed be higher government expenditure. But as you can see from the example of the health service in the UK, it doesn't always necessarily mean that it's higher expenditure than you get in the kind of mixed private public health service that you currently have in the United States. So I guess what I'm trying to lay before you is a picture of an American society that might be more prepared to engage in public provision of health, education and welfare in more universal terms without seeing it as being socialist.
Well, I would say that that would require trust. And I'd say the trust between the citizenry and the government is, the gap's never been wider. Can't get any wider, I mean, mathematically. And that trust is not there because of what I said 30 minutes ago. I don't think over the last 40 years that the liberals have liberated, which means to set free, give people responsibility to be better at something. And I don't think conservatives conserved either. I think they're equally to blame. And as a result, people's belief that we can protect them in their streets, properly educate their children, pave their roads, people's faith that we can do that is at an all-time low. And it's at an all-time low because people have been elected at all levels of government, say one thing back in their districts, and then when they get to Raleigh, Washington, or wherever it is they serve, they do something exactly different. And what we need is we need leadership of leaders who can instill trust back in people and explain to people why we need to fix this. Be willing to talk about the esoteric thing like the biggest healthcare system in North Carolina is on a fiscal year when everything else dealing with health of those employees and retirees is on another system. It's those little things that make a difference in people's lives that's going to bring trust back into our society. But right now, that gap's at an all-time high.
Okay. What I would like to mention, by the way, also back to Ms. Hirsch's comments, that healthcare really did not exist in a meaningful way 50 years ago. And we have not learned how to really integrate the growth in knowledge with a wisdom about what is a good use of medical care and what is not a good use. I agree with you absolutely that not everything should be driven by markets. And I think one of the difficulties we've had has been indeed that screaming the term, oh, that's socialist, and therefore shutting down the conversations about the areas that indeed are best met as part of our collective well-being. A nation is actually a collective of people who choose to belong to each other in some way. And it seems quite reasonable to me that education should be one of those things we all agree on. Healthcare should be one of those things we all agree on. We don't complain about the socialist police protection we have. I haven't heard people screaming about the socialist highway system we have. So I think we do already have models for the common good and the common welfare that we can go on. And it is absolutely true that in the countries that have universal access for healthcare, they spend much less money. It's certainly devastating to hear about all these chronically undiagnosed people who actually have health insurance. That's a travesty. If people have health problems and they have health insurance, they certainly should be getting health care. So that system, there's certainly problems. My own perspective is that you need a combination of both big system thinking, you need to take a picture of the whole system, as well as looking at some of the small levers that indeed can improve it for all of us. But I agree with your point, and I think a completely purely market-driven society is not a good for anyone. And if you read Adam Smith or read John Locke, you will find that neither one of them believed in the kind of free markets that are being advocated by people in the Republican Party right now.
So a lady in the back wants to speak. Krishna.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to make a couple comments and see if you had comments in response. As a citizen of the United States, in my view, rekindling the American dream is best going to happen when we are allowed to be free people. And I personally, I don't feel like it serves us to continue to put us all in systems and groups instead of allowing individuals to seek out what's best for them and their families. It's the larger that systems get, it seems to me, as I've been observing as a parent, for example, the larger a system is, the less responsive and effective it is for individuals. Just a small example would be watching the size of the Winston-Salem Forsyth County school system growing over the last many years. And the larger it gets, the less, I'm trying to find the right word. One size does not fit all, let's put it that way. It always irked me to have to close school down when there was snow in Kernersville, but nothing happening in Clemens. So a one-size-fits-all system is not the best thing, and especially in healthcare. One of my lessons from my youth was learning how the price of dental care skyrocketed in Wilmington, Delaware when I was in middle school, and when the DuPont company announced it was going to start covering dental care. It seems perhaps one of the worst things that happened for cost, as Mr. Folwell stated, is subsidies. He stated the more that you subsidize something, the more of it you get. I would also maybe add many times the more expensive things get. And the farther away we get from the free market, the more expensive and less individualized we get. So if we're trying to rekindle the American dream, I would say when government does what government is only supposed to do and allows individuals the freedom to achieve and, yes, make profits. Profits are reinvested into business and create jobs for people. That is a better way of rekindling the American dream, in my view.
Well, what I would like to say is that I'm always fascinated when people use words like freedom, and I just want to be a free person. I'm not quite sure what that means. Very often it means I don't want what you want, and I don't care whether other people have their needs met as much as I care about making sure that I have what I want. So I'm always confused by that language, and it's used fairly regularly.
If I could, you reminded me, I forgot to say one thing. If, in my view, the church, people of faith, are better able to help people in need, and rather than the government. And thank you, Ms. Motsinger, for reminding me of that.
Okay, so we do have a separation of church and state in this country, which I thoroughly support, and I hope that most of us understand the reason for that. And charity is a wonderful thing, but it is not a way of solving the big problems that we as a society have. So I understand that some people would like that. What I have found in our school system, by the way, is that while it is very large, it is delivered in a very small way for the people in classrooms, for the individual teachers, for the individual schools. And I have been, as a school board member, profoundly moved and impressed with the people who work in our school system, with the principals, with the teachers, with the folks who drive our buses and our cafeteria workers. So I would disagree that as a large system, we don't try to find very hard how to meet the needs. The other piece is the idea that one size fits all. Actually, systems that work well never have a one size fits all. They actually are quite flexible and able to move with the needs of individuals. The lack of health insurance for so many people really is a one size fits all for those who are uninsured, which means that the one size is you don't get the care you need. And that certainly fits all of them if they don't have the resources to get it. A good system makes room for individual needs and individual choices. Not having a system actually doesn't meet those needs. Too many Americans lose their jobs and lose their health care with that loss of jobs. So in addition to the stress of being unemployed, they have the stress of not having health care anymore. I have too many patients who have sat in my office trembling, because they're not going to get their health care needs met. Something that was very personal to me is a week after the primary, my husband had a stroke in our headquarters at the end of one of our meetings, and we were all together there, and it was very frightening. I'm a PA. He was going on the ground. I recognized what was happening. We got him, somebody called 911. We took care of him, and he got admitted to the hospital. What I was acutely aware of is that for me, I could focus on the needs of my husband and on my family. I wasn't in threat of losing my home. My whole family wasn't about to go bankrupt, but that happens to too many people in America, and that doesn't look like freedom to me.
We've talked about a lot of different subjects, and it looks like we're back on the subject of health care. One of the fastest growing group of people uninsured in North Carolina are state employees. State employees who can no longer afford the family coverage that the state offers. That's horrific. They can't afford it, yet the state health plan is the largest purchaser of health care in North Carolina. So my question back to you is, if any of you were having to go out and buy Tide washing detergent for a summer camp for a year, we'd pretty much have a consensus of where you would go to do that. You would go to Costco or Sam's Club or somewhere that sells a lot of Tide detergent, because you know that by going there, you're going there and buying from somebody who has buying power that allows you to get it for less. So here we have the largest healthcare system in North Carolina, the state health plan, where the costs are getting so outrageous for family coverage that state employees, entry-level teachers, can no longer afford it for their families. And anybody in this audience who's married to a teacher or a state employee, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So what we're doing is we're driving down access to health care, and we're driving down affordability to health care. And as I said a moment ago, it's not that interesting to think about these things, but there's a lot of little reasons why this occurs. 4 years ago, some people in this room know I'm a big-time motorcyclist, and our son had just come back from Philmont. He was 14, and he decided he wanted to ride his dirt bike, and we went down to a track where I practice every couple of weeks, and he went over a jump and broke his femur. And because of a previous experience that I had as a father, I got him in the van somehow and took him to Forsyth Hospital, and because it was a trauma situation, they decided to transport him down Hawthorne Road from Forsyth Hospital to Brenner's Children's Hospital. I'm very grateful that we have both of those institutions here. But 10 days later, I get a check for $523.10 made out to me. So as a conservative, I call the state health plan administrator and I say, this is a check for $523.10 for an ambulance ride down Hawthorne Road that obviously does not belong to me. It belongs to the Forsyth County EMS, which is subsidized by every property taxpayer in our county. Why won't you send it directly to them? And they said, well, we refuse to do that. So then as a forensic accountant, I started looking into it a little bit deeper and found out just in our county, the year before that, we had had a person who called the ambulance 29 times. And every 10 days, she would get a check for $528.10 made out directly to her. Because somebody in the system was having a bad negotiation with someone else in the system where people would ride ambulances and then the check would come directly to them and the county never got its money. So I literally had to introduce a piece of legislation. I actually talked to Governor Perdue about this yesterday, just in a recap of some things that she and I had worked on together. I had to pass a piece of legislation that said that check had to be at least co-payable to the patient and to the provider. And what we find is that the person who rode the ambulance 29 times since that law's passed has not called the ambulance since, because they're no longer getting $528.10 every 10 days.
Hello.
That's an example of little things that we can do in this system to make health care more affordable and more accessible for our citizens.
Okay.
A couple points. One is that's, of course, a great argument for why we actually need a system that works as opposed to a whole bunch of different little bits and pieces. And the other thing is the Medicare Part D expressly forbid negotiating over cost of pharmaceuticals, and that was one of the kinds of pieces of legislation that have really hurt us all.
Can I just say now, we're moving towards the latter part of this session. I know Pat wants to ask a question. I want to ask a question. And it would be very nice if we could have a list of questions, and then we'll ask Dale to reply, and then Elisabeth. So Pat, would you like to don't make a statement, please, but ask a question. That'd be just great.
Well, I'm not going to ask a question. I'm just going to make a comment, okay? What seems here is that we've lost trust between the government and the people. And what's between all that is all those billionaires. It's the 350 lobbyists per senator and House representatives in Washington. That's what's happening here. And unless we stop the money that controls our officials in our government, we are not going to have a democracy in this country.
Okay, we'll get a response to that in a second. Can I just have my question in too? A different kind of question, really. I mean, you've both spoken eloquently of the problems at the state level, funding, poverty, lack of healthcare cover, and so on, and linked it back to the economic and financial crisis that surrounds us now, and which began under the last months of President Bush's term of office in 2008. So it's not a Republican and a Democratic crisis, it's a crisis that seems to run through both administrations. So my question to you both is this: can you explain to us why that crisis occurred, and what 2 or 3 pieces of public policy you would like to see put in place that might ensure that we can get out of that crisis and don't go into it again?
Excuse me. This is a question to both public servants. I agree strongly, actually, with the importance of learning critical thinking skills. I think that's one great thing about Wake Forest that provides for us. Yet our current representative, Representative Foxx, votes against education spending pretty often at the secondary and university levels. I'm fortunate enough to be able to afford to attend WFU. However, you know, a lot of my friends without a college diploma can't get the wages that they need in order to attend the college in the first place. And it's just kind of frustrating seeing that happen to people who are smarter than I am, not be able to get into the same schools or attend the same schools. So I'm just wondering, education-wise, how do you, I guess to both candidates, recommend government handle teaching critical thinking skills at the university and secondary level when our representative isn't voting for it?
The weight of money in the system, the cause of the crisis and the education agenda, and the difficulty of getting access. Do you think you could run down those for us, at least some of them?
I'll attempt to do that.
Thank you.
I'll attempt to do that by telling a story. And since I was secondarily baptized at Wake Forest Church, I hope I won't suffer too much for saying this. But you know, well, you may not know that every day that when people go to the gates of St. Peter, that you're put into little groups based on what you did back on earth. And there was this line of people called wildcatters. You may not know what a wildcatter is, but a wildcatter is a person who goes out and tries to discover oil. And this wildcatter died at about 4 o'clock one afternoon. And he got up there, and there were 6 wildcatters in line ahead of him. And St. Peter was only going to take one that day. So he was thinking about what is he going to do since they're only going to take one, and I'm number 7. So he puts his hands over his mouth and he yells out, "Oil discovered in hell, oil discovered in hell." And the first 6 people in front of him start thinking, and they just hijack it down south. So he comes up to the front of the line, and St. Peter comes by and he says, "Well, I'm only taking one today, and I guess you're it." And he said, "Well, I'll see you later. There may be some truth to that rumor." That's what happened in the financial crisis of 2008. That, as I said an hour ago, anytime you should subsidize something, you should expect to get more of it. We had a situation, a financial market that was on steroids, of people borrowing more money than they should have for things that they shouldn't have borrowed money on, that they could not afford. I remember back in 2007 going out to San Diego and looking at a piece of property that's very near the Olympic Training Center, which is south of San Diego before you get to Mexico. And this particular piece of property had, it was tens of thousands of acres, and it sort of had terraces to it. And what was happening is the people who lived at the bottom terrace, which was developed, were now mortgaging their houses and buying options on the next terrace, which would be even more scarce. And then as that terrace got developed, they were doing it all the way up the chain. And of course, when the thing collapsed, there was no equity. And what's happened with the financial crisis is that we have policies and people who kept believing their own rumors and never understood that any time you subsidize something, you should expect to get more of it. That's exactly what led to the situation that we have. But unfortunately, there are some more systemic problems that are associated with this, and after Elisabeth speaks, I might have some more comments about it.
Okay. Trust is a really important issue, because if we don't trust our government, it's very hard for us to be a nation. It's always fascinating when people say things like government doesn't work at all and there's nothing good about government and the less government the better, partly because are we going to walk away? Are we really going to walk away? Sort of like somebody who speaks badly of their spouse. Okay, either you're going to stay with this person and make a good relationship, but trashing your spouse permanently is not a very good way of raising your children or having a productive and good life together. We have chosen to belong to one country. We have chosen to be Americans together. And so having some trust in our government is vitally important. There certainly are many issues that have led to that erosion of trust. The enormous money in politics. Because what that basically, you know, when people ask me, how can you afford to run for office? I say, well, I'm trying to show that an ordinary person who is not a millionaire can run for office. Because if it turns out that that's not true, we all should know it. We all should acknowledge it. We should all say, how about every 2 years we just have an auction and pay off the national debt? If it's really true that the only way you get elected is by raising millions of dollars, we're in big trouble. If it's really true that we're willing to continue to gerrymander districts so that they're not truly competitive, we don't have the democracy we're pretending to have. So let's tell the truth here. Let's, you know, big family therapy for the country. What's really true? Do we want to go forward together? Because the bottom line is most of the people I meet say yes. We want to be Americans and we want to be together. So trust is critically important. And saying the way that we govern ourselves is that we can't solve that problem is just ridiculous. And let's just put that aside. The financial crisis certainly was many years in the making and in many ways structural. And we have to deal with the structural problems and not be so surprised that they keep happening. Certainly, you're absolutely right that the financial markets were on steroids, that deregulation made many things possible that otherwise could not have occurred, that credit hid the real loss of wages that have been going on in the United States over many years, so people were not experiencing the fact that they could not afford to have a middle-class life anymore without borrowing for it. The thing I am proudest of as a school board member in the Forsyth County Schools has been embedding the systems thinking curriculum into our school system and focusing on teaching critical thinking skills to young children, because young children learn these skills very quickly, very easily. It's much harder to have been educated in silos and then hit the college level and have somebody trying to help you think in bigger ways at that point. I'm glad that Wake Forest is a good place for learning critical thinking skills. My own experience at Wake Forest, both as a PA student and as a bioethics student, is the exact same. I think the demands are very high, and I think the education is wonderful. Ideally, those skills should be being taught in elementary schools and middle school so that by the time we hit adulthood, we're used to thinking about complex problems. Thanks.
I thought the other thrust of that last question was the problem of getting access to college because of its cost. I mean, do you have a view of that?
I'd like to just double back on something that Elisabeth said about, first of all, about redistricting. If you're concerned about redistricting, you need to blame Democrats also. If any of you are familiar with Alastair Road, how many of you are familiar with Alastair Road off Peacehaven? Raise your hand. Okay. When you go down Alastair Road, I have the right side of Alastair Road and not the left until I get to Buttonwood. And when I get to Buttonwood, I have the left and not the right until I get to Cedar Trail. And when I get to Cedar Trail, I have the left side of Cedar Trail until I get up the hill, and then I have the right side, not the left. So that was done under Democratic control in the North Carolina General Assembly. It wasn't something that was done by Republicans. The compacting of people based on their political persuasion, their gender, their color, or their economics is going on and has been going on among both parties. The second thing I'd say about loopholes, because there's been mentioned many times about, millionaires and billionaires. One of the largest loopholes in this community is the subsidies that go to nonprofits. The building that you're sitting in right now is protected by the Winston-Salem Forsyth County Fire Department. Do you know how much this campus pays for that protection? Zero. The largest user of fire, police, subsidized water and sewer, probably subsidized tipping fees, and planning and zoning in our community, the largest users of those services pay nothing for them. Let's talk about another loophole. This campus buys light bulbs and carpet and paint and rebar and paper and Pepsis and all kinds of other things. Just like when you buy those things, you pay a sales tax. The school system, when they buy all of those products, they pay a sales tax too. This campus gets all of its sales tax refunded, but the Forsyth County school system does not. So when you talk about loopholes, let's be fair. These loopholes exist at every level, especially in the nonprofit societies of North Carolina. And one of the biggest challenges we have is the amount of property that's continually taken off the books every year from people who are the largest users of our services. There's loopholes all through the tax code, and those are just a couple. And if you're not infuriated enough by the fact that the charter school and the private school in Forsyth County get their sales tax refunded, as well as Wake Forest, but the Forsyth County school system doesn't, Jeff Gordon, Jimmy Johnson, and Tony Stewart also get their sales tax refunded for their purchases too. It's rampant, and there's things that need to be fixed across the system.
Is that question just about one last?
So I have a question. So we've been throwing around words like independence and freedom, and what does that mean? But we haven't been talking about social issues. So how is it that when it comes to money and government, the Republican platform asks us to back off, but when it comes to social issues, they decide to make choices for us? When I think about the American dream, I think about people coming here for freedom of religion, for freedom of speech, for independence, to be their own person, to make their own choices. But why are politicians telling us that their first plan in office will be to repeal Roe v. Wade, or to write into the Constitution a ban on gay marriage? We haven't talked about social issues at all. I just wanted to get your perspective about that. How can we call that freedom when politicians are making decisions about our own bodies for us?
Sure, I'll be glad to respond to that. Can you point to a person who has put in their platform to repeal Roe versus Wade?
Mitt Romney has said many times that he's going to defund Planned Parenthood and that they plan to repeal Roe v. Wade.
I think I've heard him say that about defunding Planned Parenthood. But let me take one step further of things that I've been involved in as far as the social issues. Last year, I was the author of the Unborn Victims Bill in North Carolina. Now, it's really an inelegant way to end this nice forum, but I'm going to show you a picture. This is what a child looks like that's 8.5 months old that was never born, killed in utero. And the reason I bring this up is that the Unborn Victims Bill basically said that if you harm or murder a pregnant woman in North Carolina, that the district attorney has the option of charging you with 2 crimes and not 1. Now, by the way, just to tell you how extreme this is, California's had this law since Sharon Tate was murdered by Charles Manson. This law already existed on the Blue Ridge Parkway and the military bases of our state, but not anywhere else. So whether it's the celebrated cases like Lance Corporal Lauterbach or some of the others you've heard about, it's the ones that you don't hear about. Today at lunch, there was a luncheon at the Bridger Field House dealing with domestic violence. I can tell you that in North Carolina, we have women who are killed because they're pregnant. We have Corinna Broadway, who was a Shaw University student who called her boyfriend and said, "I'm pregnant." He said, "I'll be right over," and he shot her. So I'll be glad to embrace or talk about any of the social issues that you'd like to talk about. But I try to do something that connects me with problems that people have. And when I look at a grandparent, a mother who has simultaneously lost a daughter and a grandchild in one horrendous act, and the fact that that child was not recognized in the eyes of the law, those are things that I embrace and that I work on. And by the way, that legislation, when it ultimately came to the floor, for 6 years, the people who have gone on record to testify in favor of that legislation are people like Alan Dershowitz, Walter Dillinger, former Solicitor General to President Clinton, and Ted Olson, the former Solicitor General to President Bush. Those are the things that I embrace on the social side and things that I work on that I think make a difference. The other thing that you'll read a lot about in North Carolina is the Woman's Right to Know legislation. And some people are offended about the ultrasound portion of that law. I think I'm correct to say, and I think it's important that any man, when they're commenting on these kinds of issues, understand there's some things they may not know. But I think it's correct to say that any time an abortion is performed in this state over the last 30 years, that the ultrasound was always a requirement, but the requirement to show it to the mother was not there. So this is not requiring people to get ultrasound. That's always been in the law. It's a requirement that says that an ultrasound will be performed, which has always been the law, and the mother will have the right to see that, or shall see it. So a lot of these issues get blown way out of proportion when people haven't actually read the bills that surround them.
But is it final word? No, it's final to this question?
Yes, and then we'll take a very
Okay.
quick.
So as far as social issues go, I certainly believe that women, men, families have a right to make their own personal choices. Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. I worked in women's health for many years as a healthcare provider, and I found that that was a very personal, difficult, and thought-out decision for most of the people I had conversations with. I certainly am concerned about women's ability to access contraception, and there was one of those recent articles in the journal, which was one of kind of that said that when teenagers were given free contraception, pregnancy rates went down. So it certainly seems to work if women have access to contraception and it is paid for, because that $10 to $30 a month for birth control pills, for example, is a real barrier for many women. They actually chose longer-term contraception, and that's part of the reason it was so effective. I support full marriage equality because I believe that sexual orientation is inherent to a human being, that it is not a choice, and therefore to discriminate against our brothers and sisters doesn't make any kind of sense to me at all. So I would agree with you that it's fascinating when we talk about freedom, that freedom to be who you are, to love who you love, to make decisions that are profoundly personal, should be left to the individuals making them.
Okay, well, can I say to both our speakers how grateful we are for you coming, and just invite you to, Dale first, if you would, just to reflect once more on the rekindling of the American dream concerns of this symposium, and how far you see a conservative philosophy, the kind you hold, contributing to that rekindling.
Well, I'll sort of end where I started, and that is that I've been spending a lot of time this year thinking about abandonment and the invisible people who are not getting what they need, who aren't able to reach their potential. I also spent some time this year studying Sheldon Steele and Taylor Branch and doing a lot of research into Martin Luther King Sr., not Martin Luther King Jr. And it leads me sort of to have these closing comments. I think it's real easy to focus on charity. What I've always tried to do as a legislator and as Speaker Pro Tem of the House is focus on justice. if you focus on justice in the front end, there's not as much need for charity on the back end. That's something I've always tried to do. The second thing is that I try to remind people that no one gets anywhere by themselves. And that whether it's...
Sounding like a Democrat.
Well, I remember before I was delivering papers, I was shoveling gravel for a plumber, and I don't know if any of you have actually really shoveled gravel before, but see some shaking the heads. There's a technique to it. And I don't care if it's being a school board member, being a congresswoman, being the speaker pro tem, that you can always learn from somebody who can show you a way to do things better. And then I'll close by saying something that I recently heard from the CEO of Krispy Kreme, who was speaking at the 50th anniversary of the Boyles Lecture Series at Appalachian. And he said, "My goal is to walk slower and bow more." And that's what I've tried to do as an elected official, to understand that I'm an employee of the people. I have 67,000 employers in my district, and I'm their employee. And I think if we have elected officials who remember that they cannot apply for the job by saying one thing back in their districts and doing another thing when they get to Raleigh or Washington, I think a lot of the problems that have been mentioned today can be fixed for the future of our country.
Barbara Ehrenreich said something that I think is very telling, and she said, people are not poor because of character flaws. They're poor because they don't have enough money. And they don't have enough money because they're not paid well for their work. I am very aware of the so-called invisible people. They're my patients, they're kids in our schools, they're the person sweeping the floors in the supermarket, they're the people who do a lot of the work that we don't see. It's fascinating if you're ever in a hotel to watch whether guests notice the cleaning lady or not, because it's important. From my perspective, everybody counts, everybody matters, and whether I see you as an individual person or I merely know that there are thousands and millions of us, it's important to make policies that treat each and every one of us as if we really mattered. And unfortunately, right now, our Congress is not doing the people's bidding. Our Congress is doing the bidding of the wealthy. Our Congress is doing the bidding of the powerful. Our Congress is doing the bidding of corporations. And my goal as a congresswoman is to keep my ordinariness, which is a wonderful thing and not something I wish to ever escape from. When I'm on the campaign trail, there's a funny little piece of poetry I often repeat that means a lot to me, and it comes from William Stafford, and here it is, the first stanza of Allegiances. It's time for all the heroes to go home, if they have one. Time for the rest of us, the common ones, to locate ourselves by the real things we live by. We live by very real, tangible things. We live by decent homes and good food to eat and a livable, sustainable world. We live by engaging conversation in good schools and people who love us and by belonging to our communities. The real things we live by are wanting the best for the generations that come after us and protecting the people who allowed us to ever be here at all. And I hope that as your Congresswoman, I will be able to bring into the walls of the U.S. House of Representatives the real things that we live by. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we move in 30 minutes into the music of the American Dream. So do stay. some fabulous music and some fabulous conversation about music and the American dream. Thank you very much for your reading.